This slip is association property now, and your little fishing boat is being removed at your expense. That was Brenda Coyle, president of the Lake Marine Shores Homeowners Association, standing at the end of my dock on a Tuesday morning in a coral blazer and white sneakers, reading off a clipboard while a tow rig idled on the gravel behind her. She was talking about a dock she believed belonged to her association. She was talking about a boat she believed she had the authority to seize. She had a laminated map, a printed resolution, and a man with a winch. What she did not know was that the dock, the slip, the gravel her tow rig was parked on, and roughly 900 feet of shoreline in both directions were not association property at all. They were the Marina, and I owned the Marina. I had owned it for 22 years, and my father had owned it for 30 before that. And the deed that said so had been recorded at the county courthouse in 1961, long before Lake Marine Shores existed as anything but a cow pasture with a view. So let me ask you something. The way I asked myself that morning while a stranger in a blazer told me my own boat was being towed off my own land. What would you have done? Standing on a dock your family built, holding a coffee mug, listening to someone explain that the ground under your boots had been voted into somebody else's jurisdiction at a meeting you were never invited to? I did not raise my voice. I went and got the folder. My name is Hal Brenner. I was 61 years old that summer, and I had run Brenner's Landing, the only public marina on the south end of Lake Marine, since my father handed me the keys and the ledgers in the spring of 2003. Before that, I was a marine surveyor for an insurance underwriter for 19 years, which is a fancy way of saying I spent 2 decades being paid to read documents very carefully, to walk a boundary with a tape and a plat in my hand, and to write down exactly what I found in language a court could use. That job taught me one thing above all others. Paper outlives people, and the paper that gets recorded outlives the paper that does not. The marina sat on 11 acres of waterfront and a strip of submerged land my grandfather had bought from the original ranch when the lake was first dammed. 11 acres of pine and gravel, and a long crib dock my father rebuilt by hand in 1978. And a little office with a wood stove and a wall of cubby holes where I kept the slip rental agreements going back to the Eisenhower years. The cubby holes were oak, built by a man who is gone now, and each one had a brass tag with a slip number stamped into it, and the agreements inside were yellowed and soft at the folds. I could put my hand on any one of them in the dark. That was not tidiness for its own sake. That was the habit of a man who had learned in another life that the difference between keeping your land and losing it is sometimes nothing more than whether you can find the right piece of paper before the other fellow runs out of patience. My wife, Diane, had run that office with me for 18 of my 22 years. She was the one who taught me to write the date on a thing the moment it came through the door, in pencil in the top right corner, before I even read it. She used to say a letter without a date was a rumor, and a letter with a date was evidence. And the only difference between the two was a pencil and 10 seconds. She passed 2 winters before that summer. Quietly, after a long illness, she met with the same level patience she brought to a stack of invoices. I had kept her reading glasses on the windowsill above the register, because I was not ready to move them, and because some mornings I still talked to her while the coffee dripped. When the first letter from the association came, the first thing my hand did, without my telling it to, was reach for a pencil and write the date in the top right corner. Some things a good woman teaches you do not leave when she does. Our daughter Casey was 16 that summer. She lived with me in the house up the rise behind the office, and she worked the fuel dock on weekends. And she was the one who first noticed the surveyor's flags. Lake Marine Shores had gone up on the north and east shores over about a decade. A gated community of big houses with lawns that ran down to the water and a marina of their own. A private one, all floating slips and an electronic gate. Their HOA covered those streets and those lawns and that private basin. It did not cover 1 inch of my 11 acres. The lake itself was managed by a water district. The surface was public, and the bottom under my dock belonged to me by a deed that spelled out the metes and bounds in chains and links the way they wrote them in 1961. Brenda Coyle had been president of that association for 6 years. I knew her the way you know a neighbor you have never spoken to, by her car and her habits. She drove a white SUV with a vanity plate, and she ran the association the way some people run a small country they have crowned themselves over. I had heard she was tightening things up. I had not expected her to tighten them around my throat. It started, the way these things do, with a letter. The first notice came in May. It was printed on association letterhead, and it informed me that a recent survey commissioned by the Lake Marine Shores HOA had determined that the southern shoreline, including the structure identified as the public dock, fell within the association's planned unit development boundary, and that all watercraft moored there were subject to association registration and fees. It asked me to register 4 boats, including my own, and to remit a seasonal mooring assessment. I read it twice. Then I did what I have done with every piece of paper that has ever tried to take something from me. I dated it, I made a copy, and I put the original in a labeled folder. The label said Lake Marine Shores. I had no idea that May morning how thick that folder was going to get. I wrote back. I was polite. I told them, in 2 short paragraphs, that Brenner's Landing was a separate parcel, that I held the recorded deed, that their planned unit development could not annex private fee land by drawing a line on a map, and that they were welcome to inspect the recorded plat at the county office anytime. I attached the parcel number. I did not attach the deed itself, because you do not hand a stranger your whole hand at the start. The second notice arrived 11 days later. It ignored everything I had written. It assessed a late fee on the registration I had not paid, and it added a fine for an unapproved structure, which I gathered meant the dock my father built before their first house was framed. The fine was $200. I dated it, copied it, and filed it. That made 2. That was the summer I started keeping the binder the way Diane used to keep the office, which is to say completely. Every letter, every fine, every voicemail transcribed by hand on a legal pad with the date and the time. I bought 2 cheap cameras and put one on the office and one on the dock, and I set them to save to a card and to a drive in the house. Because a marine surveyor learns early that a single copy is the same as no copy. Casey thought I was overreacting. She was 16, and to her the whole thing was a woman in a blazer being ridiculous about a dock that had obviously been there her entire life, and her father's life before that. "Why don't you just call them and tell them?" she said one evening, watching me number the second notice and slide it into the folder. "Tell them they're wrong and be done with it." I told her something my father told me at the same table when I was about her age and impatient in about the same way. I told her that the people who lose these fights are almost never the ones who were wrong. They are the ones who could not prove they were right. Being right is the easy part, I told her. Anybody can be right. The whole job is being able to put your finger on the line that proves it, on a day when a stranger with a clipboard and a tow truck has decided otherwise. She rolled her eyes a little. Even so, she started helping me with the cameras that week, and she never rolled her eyes about the binder again. The third step came in June, and it came in person. It was a Thursday, a little after 10 in the morning, and I was changing the oil on the courtesy pontoon when a man in a polo shirt and khakis walked down my gravel like he was inspecting a property he already owned. He had a clipboard and a lanyard with a laminated badge, and he had a pen tucked behind his ear, like a man who had watched a show about building inspectors. He introduced himself as the association's compliance officer. His name, he said, was Dale. He said the word compliance the way some men say the word doctor, hoping the title would do the work their face could not. I wiped my hands on a shop rag, and I did not get up right away. I asked him who he worked for. He said the association. I asked him if he was a licensed marine inspector or county code officer, and he said, with a small, important lift of the clipboard, that he was authorized by the board. I told him that authorization by a board he belonged to was not authority over land he did not own, and that there is a word for a man who walks onto a marina he does not own and starts taking measurements, and the word is trespasser. He blinked at that. I asked him to leave. He did not leave right away. He walked the length of my dock, taking photographs, holding the clipboard against his chest like a shield, narrating into a little recorder about unapproved structures and non-compliant moorings. He took a picture of my father's runabout. He took a picture of the fuel pump. He took a picture of the wood stove pipe coming out of the office roof, as if a chimney were a violation. When he finally backed up the gravel toward his car, he told me the board would be in touch, and I told him I had no doubt of it. And I lifted my own phone and took a photograph of him photographing me. He did not like that. The badge, I noticed when he turned, was the kind you order online with your own title printed on it. And the lanyard was brand new, and his shoes had never seen gravel before that morning. That was step 3. I filed the photographs he did not know I had taken of him taking photographs, and I wrote Dale, compliance officer, no license, on the legal pad with the date and the time. The real shape of it came clear to me in July, and it came clear by accident. Casey had a friend whose mother worked at the county planning office, a woman named Sandra, and at a backyard barbecue in the second week of July, I overheard 2 things that rearranged the whole summer in my mind. I was standing by the cooler, not really listening, holding a paper plate, when Sandra said to another woman that the big development on the North Shore had finally filed for their marina expansion, and the drawings were something else. A whole new basin, 40 slips, a fuel dock, a little store. I kept my face still, and I kept eating my potato salad, and I listened the way I used to listen in a deposition, which is to say completely, while looking like I was somewhere else. The first thing I learned was that Lake Marine Shores had filed a preliminary plan to expand their private marina, a big new floating basin with a fuel dock and a ship store and 40 new slips. The second thing, and Sandra said it almost as an aside, was that the engineer's drawings for that expansion showed the new basin reaching south, across the cove, onto the shoreline that the association's letters kept insisting was theirs. My shoreline. My 11 acres. She said the south end of the drawing ran right down past the old public marina. And wasn't it something how those things grow? I set my plate down. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, who the applicant on the expansion was. She thought about it for a second and said it was a development company. She couldn't recall the exact name. But the principal was a fellow who lived up in the shores, married to the woman who ran the HOA. His name, she said, was Greg. Greg Coyle. I want to be careful here because I did not know everything that night, and I will not pretend I did. What I knew was a permit application and a last name. The last name did the work. Brenda Coyle was not annexing my marina because she misread a map. She was annexing my marina because her husband's company needed my waterfront to build the thing that was going to make them rich. And the cheapest way to get 11 acres of recorded deed is to convince the man who holds it that he never really held it at all. That was the night the folder stopped being a nuisance and started being a case. I drove to the county courthouse the next morning when it opened. The records room is in the basement, fluorescent and cool, with long oak tables and the smell of old paper and toner that I had spent half my working life breathing. The clerk behind the counter was a woman about my age named Eunice, who had pulled records for me back in my surveying days. And when I told her what I was after, she just nodded and said, "The Brenner parcel, sure." And she had the book down before I finished asking. I pulled my own deed, certified, and I pulled the recorded plat. And I pulled the chain of title back to 1961, link by link, deed to deed, every transfer. Until I reached the original conveyance from the ranch to my grandfather, with the metes and bounds written out in chains and links the way they wrote them then. While I was there, I pulled the association's recorded declaration too. The founding document that defined exactly what land their planned unit development covered. I read it standing at the counter in the same way I used to read a vessel's documentation before I would sign off on a hull. Slowly. Twice. Running a finger down each paragraph. Looking for the one line that mattered. Because in a document like that, there is always one line that matters, and a great many lines put there to make you tired before you find it. The declaration described the association's land by reference to a recorded subdivision plat. That is normal. That is how it is done. So I pulled that plat too, and I unfolded it on the oak table under the fluorescent light, and I put my finger on the southern boundary. It ran along the section line at the top of the cove. It stopped there. It did not cross the water. It did not touch my 11 acres. It never had. Somebody had drawn a hopeful line on an engineer's rendering, and somebody had written letters as if that line were law. But the recorded declaration, the actual founding document of the actual association, drew the boundary exactly where my father always said it was, and exactly where my grandfather's 1961 deed said it was. And the two lines, drawn 60 years apart by people who never met, lay one on top of the other, like they had been traced. I stood there a while looking at it. Eunice asked me if I had found what I needed. I told her I had found what I already knew, but now I could prove it. I had the deputy clerk certify copies of all of it, the deed, my plat, the chain of title, the association declaration, and their plat with the section line on it. Then I went home and I added it to the binder, and for the first time that summer I slept the whole night through. The escalation did not stop just because I had the paper. It got worse, because that is what these things do when the money behind them gets nervous. In late July they sent a lawsuit. It came by certified mail in a thick envelope, and I signed for it on the gravel with the carrier waiting. And I wrote the date in the top right corner before I opened it, in pencil, the way Diane taught me. It was a civil complaint filed by the association seeking a declaration that the southern shoreline was common area, and an injunction barring me from, in their words, obstructing association access to association property. I had been sued before in my surveying years, the way an expert witness gets sued. And I knew the first thing you do with a lawsuit is read every word, twice, and the second thing you do is hand it to a lawyer and stop trying to be your own. I hired a woman named Ruth Okafor, a property attorney in the county seat who had spent 30 years untangling exactly this kind of mess. Her office was up a narrow stair over a hardware store, and the walls were lined with bankers' boxes, and she had a way of going very quiet while she read that told me more than any speech could. I set the certified declaration and the certified deed on her desk side by side. She read the deed, she read the declaration, she read the plat with the section line on it. She set them down, squared the edges with 2 fingers, and she looked at me over her glasses. She said, "Mr. Brenner, They have sued you over land their own founding document says they do not own. In 30 years, I have rarely seen a case this clean. The question is not whether you win. The question is how much they spend losing and what they are willing to do before a judge makes them stop. I asked her what she thought they would do. She took off her glasses and she said, "People who file a suit this week usually have a reason that is not in the suit." Find the reason. I told her I thought I already had. And I told her about the Marina expansion and the name Greg Coyle. And she put her glasses back on and pulled a legal pad toward her and said, "All right. Now it is a case." She was right about the second part. They were willing to do quite a lot. The fourth step landed on my regular customers. Brenner's Landing kept maybe 30 boats in season, working boats mostly, a few retirees, a fishing guide named Pete, who had launched out of my ramp for 20 years. Pete was a big, quiet man who tied better knots than anyone on the lake and never said 2 words where one would do. In August, my renters started getting letters too. Association letters, telling them their boats were illegally moored on association common area and would be subject to towing and impound fees if not registered with Lake Marine Shores. 2 of them came to me at the office with the letters in their hands. The first was a retired schoolteacher named Frank, who kept a little sailboat in Slip 9, and his hands were unsteady when he set the letter on the wood stove table. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular anger of a careful man who has done nothing wrong and is being told he has. He asked me if he needed a lawyer. The second was Pete, and Pete did not get worked up. Pete just stood in the doorway with his cap in his hand and said, "Hal, they called my charter, Sunday's charter, told them my launch was tied up in a legal dispute and they ought to find another guide." He lost the day. $400 and a client he had kept for 6 years, gone on a phone call from a woman who had never once set foot on my gravel. I sat with each of them at the wood stove table in the office, and I poured the coffee, and I opened the binder, and I showed them the certified declaration, and I showed them the line on the recorded plat that stopped at the top of the cove. And I told them the same thing every time. You are moored on my land. Your agreement is with me, and it has been for years, and it is good. If anyone tows your boat off my dock, that is not enforcement. That is theft, and we will treat it as theft. Keep the letter. Write down the date you got it, and the date of any phone call and who called. I will need it, and when this is over, you will be glad you kept it. Frank kept his. Pete kept his. And he wrote the date of the charter call on the back in pencil and handed it to me to copy. And he said, "You sound like a man who has done this before." I told him I had spent 19 years being paid to read documents for a living, and that a marina was just a smaller deposition with better weather. Every one of those letters went into the binder. By the end of August, the tally was 11 written notices, 2 formal fines, 1 trespassing compliance officer, 1 lawsuit, and now harassment of 6 paying customers. I wrote the count at the bottom of a legal pad page the way my father used to total a column, and I underlined it once. The 5th step is the one Ruth had warned me about. It is the one where a person who is losing on paper decides to win on the ground before the paper catches up. It happened on a Tuesday in early September, and Casey saw it before I did. She came running up to the house at 7 in the morning, still in the t-shirt she slept in, and she said, "Dad, there are men at the dock, and they have a truck, and they cut the chain." I went down the rise in my work boots with the coffee still in my hand. There were 2 men in vests, a flatbed tow rig, and Brenda Coyle in a coral blazer and white sneakers standing at the head of my dock with a clipboard, reading me a resolution. They had cut the cable I kept across the gravel drive. They had backed the rig down to the water. And they had already winched the bow of my own boat, the little aluminum runabout my father bought in 1989, halfway up onto the flatbed. "This slip is association property now," she said, "and your little fishing boat is being removed at your expense." I have been angry a few times in my life in a way that I felt in my hands. This was one of them. My jaw set and my fingers found the cold metal of the mug and held it. And I stood very still. Because I have learned that the worst thing you can do at the exact moment someone wants you to lose your head is to lose it. Casey had her phone up and was recording from the top of the rise, which is the smartest thing anyone did that morning. And I told her quietly to keep it up and to call the sheriff's non-emergency line and tell them there was a theft in progress at Brenner's Landing. I did not argue with Brenda Coyle. I have learned that you do not argue with the costume. You wait for the authority. I asked the two men in vests one question. I asked them if they had a signed court order authorizing them to seize a vessel, because an HOA resolution is not a court order. And removing property without one is not towing, it is conversion. And the man who signs the work ticket is the man who gets named in the complaint. They stopped winching. They looked at Brenda. She told them to keep going. They did not keep going. There is a particular silence that falls when hired men realize the person who hired them cannot actually protect them. And that silence fell on my gravel that morning. The deputy who rolled in 20 minutes later was named Marisol Vega. She was young, careful, and visibly unhappy to be standing between a marina owner and an HOA president before she had finished her first coffee. She did the thing a good officer does. She separated everybody. She took the temperature down, and she asked the only question that mattered, which was who owned the dock. Brenda Coyle answered first and answered loud. She said the association owned the southern shoreline by the development plan and a board resolution, that the structure was unapproved, and that the marina, in her exact words, was functionally part of our jurisdiction. I had heard her use that phrase in a letter, and now I heard her say it out loud, functionally part of our jurisdiction, as if functionally were a word that could move a section line. Deputy Vega turned to me. She did not defer to me, and she did not dismiss me. She said, "Sir, do you have documentation of ownership?" This is the part of the story I had been walking toward since May, and I want to tell it to you exactly as it happened, because the shape of it is the whole lesson. I did not make a speech. I asked the deputy if she would walk with me to the office, 30 feet up the gravel. And she did. And Brenda Coyle followed, because a person like that cannot bear to be outside a room where she is being discussed. On the wood stove table, I had the binder. And on top of the binder, in a clear sleeve, I had the certified copy of the recorded deed, the certified copy of the recorded plat, and the certified copy of the association's own declaration with the boundary line highlighted in yellow. I did not hand them to Brenda. I handed them to the deputy. I said only this. This is my deed, recorded in 1961. This is the recorded plat. And this is the association's own founding declaration, the document that defines what land they govern. Their boundary stops at the section line at the top of the cove. The dock, the gravel, and the boat on that flatbed are on my land. The vessel was bought in 1989. The fines they have assessed total $400, and I have paid 0 of them, because 0 is what is owed. Deputy Vega read the declaration. She's not a property lawyer, but she did not have to be, because the association had been kind enough to write their own boundary down and record it. And the line on the plat stopped where I said it stopped. She read it twice, the way I read things twice. Then she looked up, and she looked at Brenda Coyle, and the whole morning turned over on that one look. She said, "Ma'am, this is recorded fee property. Your declaration doesn't cover it. You need to get that boat off the truck and off this man's land, and you need to do it now. Brenda Coyle said the boat was unapproved. Deputy Vega said it was not her business to approve boats. It was her business to stop a theft, and right now she was looking at one. Brenda said the board had voted. The deputy said the board could vote all day, and it would not move a property line that was recorded before the board existed. There was a paired set of numbers hanging in the air on my gravel that morning, and I want you to hear both of them, the way the deputy heard them. One deed, recorded 61 years before that Tuesday. 0 acres of my land inside their recorded boundary. Against that, 2 formal fines, 1 lawsuit, 11 notices, 6 harassed customers, and a stolen boat halfway up a flatbed. One side of that ledger was clean. The other side was a crime in progress. They put my boat back in the water. The men in vests did it carefully, slowly, one of them holding the bow line while the other worked the winch in reverse. The way you handle a thing you have just understood you should never have touched. The hull came down off the flatbed and settled into the cove with a small sound I had heard 10,000 times. And the cleats took the line. And my father's runabout floated where it had floated since 1989. Brenda Coyle stood on my gravel in her white sneakers and watched, the clipboard down at her side now, the laminated map curling in the heat. And for the first time all summer, she did not have a single word, and I did not give her one. I did not say a thing to her. Casey was still at the top of the rise with the phone, and I could see her lower it slowly, and I gave her a small nod, and she nodded back. I have read enough depositions to know that the people who win quietly are the ones who let the record do the talking. The deed had talked. The deputy had read it out loud. That was enough, and a single word from me would only have made it smaller. I would like to tell you that was the end of it. But the end was bigger than my doc, and it was not anything I did. It was the natural consequence of what the Coyles had already set in motion. Ruth Okafor took my binder, all of it. The 11 notices and the 2 fines and the lawsuit and the trespass photos and Casey's video of a tow rig winching my father's boat off my own land. And she did not just defend the suit, she countersued, and she sent the certified declaration and the development application to the county. Because here is the thing about Greg Coyle's Marina expansion. The engineer's drawings that reached south across the cove onto my 11 acres were not just wishful. They were submitted to the county as part of a permit application, under oath, representing that the applicant controlled the land. The land the applicant's own wife's association had just been told, by a sheriff's deputy and then by a judge, that it did not own and never had. The county does not take kindly to a development application that claims control of land the applicant does not control. When Ruth's filing landed, the planning office pulled the Lake Marine Shores Marina expansion for review. A representation of site control made under oath on a permit application is not a small thing. It is the kind of thing that turns a zoning matter into a question of fraud. And the county has people whose whole job is to ask that question. The permit that was going to make the Coyles rich, the 40 new slips and the fuel dock and the ship's store, was suspended pending a determination of whether the application had misrepresented site control. Greg Coyle's company had spent, I later learned from Pete, who heard it from a man who poured the test footings, the better part of 2 years, and a great deal of borrowed money on engineering and pre-sales for those 40 slips. People had put down deposits. A bank had committed to a construction loan against a basin that was drawn, in part, across 11 acres that the developer's own wife's association had just been told, by a sheriff's deputy and then by a judge, that it did not own and never had. All of it sat frozen in a county file, while a reviewer worked through whether the man who signed the application had told the truth about the ground. The lawsuit against me was dismissed in November. The judge did not need a trial. He had the recorded declaration and the recorded plat in front of him, the association's own documents, and he ruled from the bench that the southern shoreline was not common area, had never been common area, and that the association had no authority over Brenner's Landing or any vessel moored there. He awarded my legal costs against the association. The fines were void. The registration demands were void. The compliance officer's authority was, in the judge's dry phrasing, an authority the association had invented for itself. Ruth gathered up the certified copies afterward in the hall, squared the edges with 2 fingers the way she did, and said, "That is the cleanest hour I've spent in a courtroom in some years." I told her it was the cheapest hour I had ever bought. Brenda Coyle resigned the presidency before the next annual meeting because the homeowners of Lake Marin's shores, the actual neighbors, were the ones left holding the bill. Her legal adventure on my shoreline had cost their association my court costs, their own attorney's fees, and a special assessment to cover both. And the Marina expansion that was supposed to raise their property values was frozen in a county file. They had not asked for any of it. They had trusted a president who told them a line on a rendering was the same as a line on a deed. The board that replaced her sent me a short letter that fall. It was an apology, and it registered no boats and assessed no fines, and I filed it too, in the same folder, because that folder had earned the right to hold the ending as well as the beginning. The boat my father bought in 1989 went back in its slip, and it is in that slip today. There is a moment near the end of all this that I keep, the way you keep a photograph in your wallet. It is a Sunday evening in late September, after the deputy and after the men in vests and before the judge. Casey and I were sitting on the end of the crib dock my father built in 1978, our feet over the water, and the light was doing the thing it does on Lake Marina in the fall. Gold coming in low across the cove and lighting up the pines on the far bank. She had her phone in her lap, the same phone that had recorded the whole thing. And she said, without looking at me, "I'm glad you kept all the paper, Dad." I told her that her grandfather kept it before me, and her grandmother kept it better than either of us, and that someday the office and the cubbyholes and the binder would be hers, and she should keep it too. She said, "Okay." That was all. Okay. The water moved against the cribbing the way it has moved against it for 50 years, and Diane's reading glasses were up on the windowsill in the office behind us, and for the length of that gold light, everything that needed keeping was kept. So here is the lesson, the plain one, the one I would want a neighbor to take away if he were sitting across the wood stove table from me with a letter in his hand and a knot in his stomach. Know what you own. Not roughly, not by habit, not by what your father always said, although your father was probably right. Know it on paper. Go to the county and pull your deed, certified, and pull the recorded plat, and read the metes and bounds, and walk your boundary with that plat in your hand until you can put your finger on every corner. If there is an association near you, pull their recorded declaration too, because the same document that lets them govern their own land is the document that proves they cannot govern yours. The line that protects you is already written down. You just have to be the one who went and got it. Keep the records. Every letter, every notice, every fine dated and copied the day it arrives, in one labeled folder you can carry into a courthouse. Put a camera where the trouble is and save what it sees to 2 places. When somebody in a blazer tells you the ground under your boots belongs to them, do not argue with the blazer. Get the paper and let a neutral officer or judge read it, because the deed does not raise its voice and it never loses its temper. And it was recorded long before anyone decided to come take what it describes. If a story like this happened to you or to someone on your road, tell me about it in the comments. I read them. If you want more of these, the kind where the quiet owner turns out to hold the older paper, subscribe and stick around. Next time, I'll tell you about a retired county road engineer whose HOA paved a driveway across his easement to reach a new cul-de-sac and never once checked who held the right-of-way underneath their fresh asphalt. Keep your deed where you can find it. I'll see you on the next one.